Hi, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live hosted by the European Organization Design Forum. I am Heather Stevens, and today our guest is here to talk about the theme that we have for the month of October, which is Back to Basics in Org Design. He is an EODF trustee. He works in partnership with Jody Golden at Org Design Works. They help companies align their organizations to deliver new strategies and capabilities. They work with global purpose-led businesses in heavy industries using whole system design, co-creation, and deep engagement. He has a background in HR leadership, org design consulting. He's led large global programs. He serves as a board trustee for a charity focused on overseas development, and he also holds a WSET Level 3 distinction in wines. So it's a great guest today to talk about the basics of org design, things to consider when you are starting a career in org design, what kind of capabilities are needed for this role. I would like to welcome Richard Lucas.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Heather. That's an amazing introduction. And perhaps I should talk more about wine than organization design today.
Okay.
Would that be more interesting for
I'll
people?
throw out the script. Everybody wants to hear about wine.
It's a pleasure.
So yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So there's a lot that I think that we could learn from you, but I want to start with just kind of tell us a little bit about your background, what it was that drew you to this field of org design.
Sure. So my love affair with organization design probably goes back to when I was about 24, which is an awful long time ago. But I was in the car industry in HR, and I was responsible for this particular company, responsible for management, development, and resourcing in their engines and gearboxes business, right? And we were building three new factories, and I had the opportunity to lead the organizational setup of those new factories. So everything from structure and role design through ways of working and shift patterns, and everything from a people point of view that you could imagine was part of setting up essentially new facilities covering about, I suppose, maybe 5,000-6,000 people. And that was fantastic. I just absolutely loved that. It was holistic. It was part of the strategy, the business strategy. It was a high-profile project. And I guess when that finished, I went back into kind of more transactional HR work, and I got bored. And that was when I moved into consulting, and spent the next, I suppose, I don't know, however many years working in probably more general performance improvement and transformational change work, change management work, a lot of technology enabled work, ERP, the ERP boom, if people remember back to the year 2000 and all of that. So I did a lot of more general people-based consulting, but I guess I really started thinking that I was an organization designer around about 2010. And I was at PwC, and I had the opportunity to lead the organization design team there for a while. And the projects that I started to do were very strategic, and they were dealing with the operating model, the fundamentals of how the organization worked working at a very senior level, but seeing it end to end from strategy through to implementation. So that work, those projects really started, I suppose, for me in about 2010. So about the last 15 years, I suppose I've considered myself to be an organization designer. And as we know, organization design is a broad area of practice. And so a lot of the work I do today still moves into areas of organization development and more general sort of change management type work as well. But org design is my passion. But it started way back then, many years ago.
You were 24, so that must have been 2020, right?
Right. Yeah. Try 1980 something. Yeah.
Okay. I won't tell you what year I was born. So one of the things I love about org design is that it is so multidisciplinary, and there are so many facets of it. There's things about human behavior, there's things about business, there's sort of design as a discipline. And one of the things that we talked about in preparation for this that I found very interesting is in your work in Org Design Works, you are very specific about the types of companies that you work with.
Mm.
And you have a kind of clear rationale for which businesses you choose to work with. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very privileged to be able to work with organizations that have a very clear purpose and a purpose that everybody can sign up to and say, yep, that's something that is doing something good for people, the planet, society, and so on. And so, organizations that have a strong sustainability DNA are the types of organizations that we work with, or we like to work with the most. We also like to work with people who make stuff, and actually where there is a tangible product at the end of it. That's probably, Jodie grew up in the kind of chemical sector, and I grew up in the car industry. So we've both got sort of dirty fingernails, and we much prefer the tangible to the more ethereal and intangible, and so on. But that's not to say that we haven't worked with financial services or technology or public sector or charities and so on. But manufacturing and heavy industry is our core. But the other thing that we're very, very clear about is we have a very strong, very clear set of criteria for organizations to get the most out of working with us. They have to really want to start with the strategy, move into what, so we have a very clear set of principles, and I'll try and make it as simple as possible, because we try and make our practice as simple as possible. It's what are you trying to achieve? It's what do you need to be really good at to get there? And how can you engage the whole organizational system to make that happen? Those are the three things that we ask. And so if an organization's not prepared to engage the people who are doing the work more widely and more deeply, then they're really not going to get the best out of working with us, but out of working with anybody, frankly, any organization, design practitioners. And if the work is not strategic, i.e., it doesn't have to be at the very top level of the organization. If you're working at a functional level or at a unit level, I think a really good question for practitioners to ask is, how is what you're trying to achieve in service of the broader strategy of the business? How can you connect the work you're doing and the changes that you're seeking to make to that broad strategy that gives people a real sense of connection to where the organization's going, rather than some vague notion of we need to be better. Actually, if it's more specific around, well, we're really trying to achieve this, we're really trying to grow this market, or we're trying to launch these new products, or we're there's a different customer proposition, or whatever it is.
So do you have a way of sort of pressure testing that a company's kind of strategy, purpose, vision is solid enough to embark on an org design exercise?
Well, it's not that we do have a process, but it's not that we would challenge the strategy per se. We wouldn't challenge that. We're not strategists. We're not going to be telling organizations they should be suddenly be pivoting from agriculture to making washing machines, or going from this market into that market, or whatever. But it needs to be clear. So whatever their choices are, what are they trying to achieve, and what are they definitely not trying to achieve, that needs to be clear, because that's the story that needs to be told around why we're doing this. And it's also because the capabilities, the things you need to be really good at in order to achieve that strategy, those are the things you're really designing, right? So if there are, I work with a client where we started with the hypothesis that we needed to have an organization structure that was lighter in terms of its span of control and lighter in terms of its number of levels. By the time we'd finished, we were designing 2 new capabilities for that organization, and the structure that the leader had as a hypothesis was probably about 60% correct. So the work, I think if we're, as practitioners, if we're able to connect the work that the organization wants to do around redesign to that strategic intent, that's really, really important. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that that sort of getting that strategy bit solid is definitely a challenge in its own right. And when I have worked in org design projects, which are certainly not as many as you have, but getting that clarity is its own kind of specific challenge, because I notice a lot of times people like to keep things a little bit ambiguous so that they have some room to maneuver, or they can hedge a little bit what they think is a risk of putting all their money in one area, but then you end up kind of spreading yourself too thin.
Yeah, I mean, if I give you just a couple of examples. So a couple of years ago, Jodie and I worked with one of the functions within one of our global clients. So it's actually the HR function, and we were looking globally at how the HR function sort of set itself up. Lots of things were kind of going wrong, lots of issues, lots of problems. But fundamentally, we worked with that HR leadership team to understand what HR's contribution should be to the business strategy, 4 pillars of business strategy, and how did what HR does or should do tie into each of those four pillars. We were very, very specific about that and said, look, that's where we need to be investing. So to your point about where do we invest, that's where we need to be investing in developing our people, in making sure the organization works well, making sure our roles and our structures are right, our processes and our skills are the right skills and so on. So making that whole system of organization work in service of delivering those things for those 4 strategic pillars. That was a bit of different thinking, right? Because they up to that point they thought, well, what's HR best practice, right? It's a very vague thing, right? It's a very vague notion. So, but it sort of opened their eyes to a different way of thinking. It was very successfly. And then another example would be an organization we were working with in the US, where we were tying the operations division into and really trying to make some assumptions and some really clear assumptions about what is it from a customer point of view that the operations division was really trying to achieve, and working with about 70 of their plant managers to help them think through how does what we do on a day-to-day basis, and therefore what we need to change on a day-to-day basis, how does that tie in with different customer propositions, opening up new markets, new products, and so on. So that's just a couple of examples. It's and I think if you're working whether you're working in the boardroom or whether you're working with functional teams or wherever in the organization you're working, it's trying to tie the what are we doing back to the strategic intent. It's really, really important.
Yeah, everything kind of leads back to that. So I do a lot of org development work, and that is the thing that I noticed, that when there is a pattern of a problem, that it very often can be drawn back to, well, it's not entirely clear what we're trying to achieve here, and so what kind of trade-offs we should be making in the structure.
I mean, there's a often sort of well quoted something that is well quoted is, every organization is perfectly designed for the results they're getting today. So if you want to redesign, well, you need to be clear about what results you're trying to achieve in the future. And if you want different results in the future, you probably ought to be redesigning your organization. So the two things work each way. But I'm often, I often hear from people who are doing organization design work just because that function or that business unit thinks that they need to do something better. And so what's the right organization that we should be putting in place? Well, there isn't one, unless you're really clear about what you're trying to achieve. So it doesn't matter how you organize if you're not clear. So there are many different contexts for organization design work. I think that's really important to draw out. There is no standard organization design project. There are
so sorry to interrupt you, but I was just going to say that leads into another question that I had, which was kind of, what does the workflow look like? How do you decide whether you need a kind of a current state analysis, or whether you skip that step entirely, or how do you sort of look at that?
Sure. I mean, there's so go back to what I was just saying. I think no such thing as a standard organization design project, but there are repeatable standard phases of work that you will probably go through in order to arrive at a successful implementation. The way you walk through those stages will be different every single time. The context will be different every single time. The speed will be different every single time. The regulatory constraints, or the environmental constraints, or the customer constraints will be different every single time. And so there is no, it's not a cookie cutter. There are some kind of principles, and I'll kind of illustrate some of that in a moment. How do you determine how much of any one phase of work you need? Let's go through some examples. So, let's imagine that you're working with the leadership team of an organization that is now taking a 10 to 25 year view of its future strategy, right? And there are, you may sort of raise your eyebrows, but there are plenty of organizations that do that have long cycle times for product development and so on and so forth. So take pharmaceuticals, take agriculture, take those, those kinds of businesses. And they're saying, right, so how do we now develop our operating model, or our high-level organization design, or our, how do we develop our organization to meet that new strategy? You don't need to go through 3 months of diagnosis and as-is assessment. You just don't, because you will get to understand what are the issues that you need to overcome in the new design by talking about what the future looks like, rather than what's today. And if you're working with a client in this, and so for those of us who are practitioners, external practitioners, or even if you're an internal practitioner, frankly, the people who need to be smart are the people who are the client, not you. And so don't spend 3 months becoming very, very smart about how the organization works. It doesn't move them forward at all, right? Really. So you're doing the consultant thing of, sort of borrowing their watch and telling them the time.
So would you consider it almost a liability in those cases to spend a lot of time on?
In some cases. There are some cases where it's absolutely essential to do an organizational baseline. So the one example, for one organization a number of years ago, the strategic driver was, it was threefold. We had to take 30% of the cost out because they'd been losing money for 3 years, and they were a charitable institution and they could not lose money. They simply couldn't. They were part of a bigger organization. They're very well known, so I won't say who it is. Sure. But we had to take 30% of the cost out, and that was 30% of the people. We also had to simplify the organization and set it up for future growth. Now, I'm very pleased to say that many years following the work, the organizational model that we put in place is still there. We also did the work by engaging about 200 people, many of whom would have been at risk through that process, in co-designing the future state for the organization. And that's another thing which we can come on to is the almost counterintuitive thing that says, well, the more you engage people, the more likely you are to have a successful outcome, even if it's one that is going to put their jobs at risk. And unfortunately, in this position, in this situation, that was the case. But in that case, we had to understand where the costs were. We had to have an absolute baseline of people and understanding where they were and what those costs were. So, and also the opportunity to do that to do that diagnosis and engage lots of people in that diagnosis, brought them into the project as well. So that was important from a change management point of view. So in those situations, you absolutely have to. The other situations where you absolutely have to are, for example, regulatory. So I've done a lot of work in the nuclear industry in the past, and there's only one regulator that I know of, and somebody will correct me, I'm sure, but the Office of Nuclear Regulation in the UK demands that they won't let you make any organization changes. They will shut you down unless you conform to a particular process. So there are certain constraints, right? So you can't go into that type of business with a design process that is kind of very loose. It has to be very tight, because it has to be auditable, right? So those would be contexts where doing that diagnosis and getting that baseline and that organizational rigor is really important, and there are technology tools and stuff that can kind of help us with that now, of course. But in other situations where that's not the case, and so imagine a context where it's growth, where it's new markets, where it's new products, where maybe it's a merger, then you start with what's the future? Where are we trying to take this business? And that's my preferred start point for that. Yeah.
So I am also quite a big believer in co-creation, and I think that it is the way that the new organization kind of is created, is by people going through these cognitive processes of internalizing the logic of why you were designing a structure in a certain way. We're getting a couple of questions, but I'm very curious about something that you mentioned when you're describing the organization where you had to cut 30%.
Yep.
So you also engaged the people who perhaps were, or maybe ultimately did end up losing their jobs. Were they aware of that when they went into that process?
Yes.
Do you feel like that helped it to be kind of a more humane process?
Yes, absolutely. So this is an organization where people felt very strongly about their connection to the organization, and people had it almost as a vocation, as a passion, and having them engaged in all that, the transparency of communications was absolute, and the engagement of hundreds of people in, for example, scenario. So we were doing diagnosis, and then we were doing scenario testing around future options, and bringing hundreds of people into that process meant that they had a stake in the future organization. And if they have a stake in the future organization, they were much more comfortable about leaving it, because they're leaving it in a sense of they have had something to do with the way that organization is now designed, and so they're leaving with that sense of, well, I've left my mark on that. Now that's not the case with everybody, but it certainly it paid a lot of dividends. If we had done the project behind closed doors, it would have taken a lot less time, but the implementation would have been extraordinarily difficult.
You'd ruin your culture that way. You'd totally violate trust.
Right. And maybe not successful. And maybe we'd have seen that business, that organization not thrive the way it has done since a number of years ago. So there are a couple of...
There's that element of change where people need to be able to say goodbye to the past. And I feel like that's kind of a beautiful way of doing that. Indeed, we have gotten a couple questions. And the first one is related to another topic that we're planning to discuss. So this is from Barbara. How easy is it to pivot to org design if you have a background in talent development, L&D, and what route would you recommend?
So let me just, I'll try and answer the question directly, but let me answer it slightly tangentially by giving you just an example of just to say a bit more about how I got into org design, right? So from an HR background, so I did a lot of learning and development work when I was in HR, in the car industry, and so on. And I worked in every area of HR. And when I moved into management consulting, a lot of the organization design work that I was doing was very HR related. So it was related to, role impacts, role design, workforce planning, recruitment, and so on. And I think, relatively successfully, sort of moved into how you can start to look at a business more structurally. But my vista was still very HR. It was very much in the HR function. So that was the value that I was bringing to the consulting work that I was doing. But when I moved into more mainstream management consulting, my understanding of business expanded exponentially, and I started to understand much more about different functions in in the business. I got some of that from my HR background, but not in the way that I got from consulting, and so I really started to understand more about strategy and markets and products, and how you and process redesign and technology and all of that. So and if you think about the organization as a whole system, which it is, then structure and roles and people and skills is one part of it, or is a couple of parts of it. Processes and policies and technology and governance and performance measures are also part of the organizational system that need to be aligned behind any effort that you're trying to make. And so that was the thing that helped me really understand what organization design was about, was combining the very deep, or the much more specialist people work that I've been doing, with a much more general understanding of business and how organizations work. So that's kind of how I would answer that question, if you like. So maybe specifically to Barbara, I'm very happy if you want to drop me a line and we can have a chat about that. Sort of more in the context of where you are. Then I'm very, very happy to do that if that would be helpful. But you can come at org design from anywhere, literally from anywhere. There's many entry points. It's not just HR. Some of the best org designers that I know are not HR specialists. So there are many routes in.
I came at it from political science. There's a person in our community who, at the conference that we had in Budapest last month, we had a conversation about how he's very interested in evolutionary theory and thinking about how that kind of framing organizational processes and change and development in that kind of really like ecosystemic development sort of way. So it really is quite an all-encompassing field, which I think is what makes it endlessly fascinating.
And if you think about the kind of socio-technical aspects of org design, then some people will come at it much more from a technical standpoint, from a process engineering, finance, whatever, and some people much more from a pure org development background. So yeah.
So we got a couple other questions, but I do want to sit in this topic. So we will take your questions, but while we're on the topic of capabilities needed for an effective org designer, I want to dig into this a little bit more. Okay. So one of the things that you've talked about a little bit is kind of the difference between strategic and tactical. So how do you think about that in this context?
I think about it in terms of both are necessary and equal components of an org design process. Sometimes you will enter the org design process at a tactical level. So your client, internal or external, will be talking about how can we make my department, my function, my business unit more effective, more efficient, whatever it is. So you might start to come in at that level. And as I've already said, I think the more you can tie that work into something more strategic, the better. Or you'll come in at a much more strategic level, saying we need to do something different with this organization because of X, Y, Z strategic intent. So those are the kind of entry point. But tactical always follows strategic, right? So if you go through a process which says we're going to understand our strategy, understand the capabilities we need to be successful, understand the kind of criteria that we need and the principles we need around our organization, look at the high level design. We then need to go into, and that might be driven by growth or new markets or M&A or new products or a new customer proposition or whatever it is. Then we need to get into the detail. Then we need to get into the how does this affect different functions, different departments? How do we design the business to meet that? And that's where the tactical org design, which is all about the jobs, the roles, the processes, the measures, and all of the things that need to be designed as components of the organizational system. That's where the tactical stuff is, what I would call the tactical stuff. And that, for me, needs to be co-created with the people doing the work.
Yeah.
And your role as a, as an org designer is to sit in the middle of that somewhere and kind of orchestrate, but hopefully with a team of people around from the business who are working on that as their part-time or indeed full-time role, depending on how big the project is. So I think tactical always follows strategic. I think but the more context you can give a smaller piece of tactical org design work, give it that strategic context, the better. And I think so there are more technical skills around, if you like, in terms of job design and process design and all of those kinds of things that are in that tactical bit. There's more volume of work. There's more technical skill. What you need in the more strategic part is so skills, or I would say skills or mindsets, or more about kind of how you think about and how you deal with leaders, really. So it's the ability to. So you need to be analytical, but you need to be create. So you need sort of analytical and creative, and you need to be. You really need to be facilitating conversations, whether it's larger scale workshops or whether it's individual formal one-to-one meetings, and so on. And that's a real skill. So but that skill comes from, it doesn't just come from org design, that comes from all sorts of different things. So it's not exclusive to us org designers. We're not necessarily just the best people at that. Lots of people are very good at that, but you do need that. You need to be able to tolerate ambiguity, because org design is not a linear process. It can be very messy. It can be very messy because people in leadership positions can have very different points of view around what's important, and your ability to navigate that is going to be tested every time you do any kind of project. How you engage people. How you look for opportunities, how you look for the art of the possible. I think all of these things are important. I don't say skills, but they're more like mindsets, really. Curiosity is a really good one as well.
Yeah, curiosity I was going to mention as well, because that's definitely coming through in the way that you're describing things. And there's an element of facilitation that is sort of like sensing the energy in a room kind of aspect of it, and being able to navigate conflict. And I've known designers who know a lot about things like decision science and stuff like that, that help them to kind of get to a point. But that the whole idea is that it's not your job to tell them how they should organize, but to get them there.
So there's a let me give you a few examples, and it's organization design can be as emotional a subject as it can be rational. Okay, and I remember working with at the very same time I worked with and they're both FTSE 100 businesses. One run by a French bureaucrat, and the other run by an ex-Hanson portfolio manager. Right, those are the two CEOs. I was working with both of them around their corporate center design. And on the one hand, you had somebody who didn't want that corporate center to be any more than 100 people, could not have these functions. He didn't want IT anywhere near him. Didn't want, right? So IT wasn't on the top table, etc., etc., etc. Right? It's got to fit into 2 floors of this building. Blah blah blah. A pathological decentralizer. On the other hand, you've got a pathological centralizer in the French bureaucrat whose corporate center was about 1,700 people. Right? So there was no right answer. Sure. I was never going to persuade the one to have a corporate center of 100, or the other to have a corporate to centralize everything into 1,700. And so you have to be able to deal with almost the whims and kind of peccadillos and preferences of some of the senior leaders. The worst thing is if you miss it. We've done this recently, right? Jody and I, we slipped up big time. We had a client out in the States, and we failed to get to one of the senior people, and he torpedoed the project.
Okay.
And the project stopped at phase 1 and did not go into phase 2. We failed to manage that particular stakeholder. So it's real, and it's yeah, you just got to be the skills in the skills in doing that you learn the more you do it, and the more mistakes you make, I guess.
Yeah, there's only one way to learn how to learn those lessons the hard way sometimes, indeed, is to do it. We have a question from Sebastian, and I know you asked another question, but this one is kind of building on what we are saying right now, which is, how do you keep your facilitation skills sharp? And I think there's a little bit of it in you have to practice.
Well, I was going to say, Seb, it's practice, absolutely practice. How do you keep? Yeah, I mean, that's it. I think once you've got to a certain level, keeping them sharp is just looking for those opportunities. And because we do, as org designers, we do a lot of facilitation. So whether that's face to face, which is what I prefer every time. I just this year I've had the pleasure of working with the leadership team of a German client, 35 of their leaders, taking them through a strategy to operating model process and working with them in two, so behind the scenes, but having 2 large 2-day workshops in February and May. It was fantastic, and just bringing those people together was great. So much prefer that. But now we do successfully run workshops and facilitate online with collaboration tools. That was something which I had to learn, and there are definitely some tips and tricks, which is probably for a different session, but there are definitely some tips and tricks around how to run effective workshops and how to facilitate large groups online using collaboration software.
There's a book that came out during the pandemic that is from a couple of women who are part of the Agile community in South Africa, and it's called The Remote Facilitators Handbook, I think.
Right.
And it is indeed all about this. And I'm a big user of Mural, and I will build pretty intricate kind of.
Some of the mistakes that I've made over the past few years, and which I don't do anymore, was when I first started doing, when part of the kind of pandemic, when we all had to go online, was to try and replicate what we were doing face to face online, right? So trying to run 4-hour, half-day workshops or a full-day workshop online, you can't do it. You just can't do it. People do not have that attention span. So what you would be able to do in an 8-hour face-to-face 1-day event, you have to spread over 4 2-hour sessions, one day after the next. So the way you design the timing of the intervention is completely different.
I find you have to, my experience anyway, is that it has to be a little more tightly orchestrated as well, because if you're in the room together, you can kind of improvise a bit. You're getting a lot more nonverbal cues, things like that you can help, but you gotta sort of build this is where I'm going if it's remote.
And just one thing that I try and do is if it's face to face, it's face to face. If it's virtual, it's virtual. Do not do hybrid workshops. Do not do that. I'm sure others on this who are listening in have probably had lots of success in doing that, but for me, it doesn't work when you have 3 people in a room and 3 people in a room and 3 people in a room and then 4 people dialing in individually. It's very hard to control a workshop that way. Everybody online or everybody face to face. It's much the best way for me. Let's say others might have a different experience, but that's
and if you've ever been the one remote person in the hybrid meeting, it can be quite difficult to follow and easy to feel sort of left out.
Right, but it is a core skill. It's definitely a core skill for the org design practitioner. Absolutely. So
we have another question that Sebastian asked a little bit earlier. I'm seeing the desire from a few of my internal customers to strengthen ways of working around prioritization and managing demand. Do you see any trends across your clients related to this?
Yeah, absolutely. We are, and certainly one client we worked with last year, this was in North America in chemicals. They really struggled with end-to-end demand planning through to inventory and production planning in the middle. So the whole end-to-end customer demand, right the way through to inventory planning. The whole thing was disconnected by disparate systems and silos of functions that didn't talk to each other, and lots of sticking plaster meetings and sticking plaster teams pulled together to try and make sense of this. Lots of firefighting and operations were completely taken over effectively by ad hoc demands and so on. So for me, there is absolutely and it was compounded by the fact that they weren't really clear about what their priorities were in terms of customer value proposition and so on. So yeah, it's a recent example, and one or two of the senior stakeholders in the business thought that was an ERP problem, and it's not an ERP problem. It's an everything problem. It's a whole organizational system problem that technology is part of, but also the behaviors and the ways of working and processes that kind of support that are really, really important too. So yeah, I think so. It definitely. I think it's a constant. I think. But it is helped by being crystal clear about what you are trying to achieve and what you're not trying to achieve. And often, organizations are trying to be all things to all people and not clear about, and I think as practitioners, we can help our clients to do that, to be clear about that without trying to overlay our own opinions and our own biases as to what they should be doing, but we can encourage them and facilitate them towards clarity.
Yes.
And I've certainly had a lot of success in that, without being a strategist, without being, trying to tell them what they should be doing.
Well, you can help them understand where kind of tension lies, where trade-offs naturally exist, that you can't have something that's very centrally controlled and also has a lot of kind of creativity, innovation, autonomy, and that those sort of that you do kind of at some point need to choose based on what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, yeah, and we know, don't we, that there are some organizational archetypes which are better suited to particular strategies. We know that, right? So, decentralized organizations tend to be more responsive. So if response to your market is the thing you're trying to achieve, then you're probably looking at some element of decentralization and so on. But it's not hard and fast rule. It's not scientific. It is sort of generally good practice, but needs to be. And so, as a hypothesis, you go in with that, but then it may be a bit more nuanced.
Yeah. So we have a last question, which I think is a very nice way to, unless anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But this question is, what are your recommendations for learning resources, ways for new practitioners? And I think Lillian is in the chat and mentions the EODF masterclass. We don't want to stop mentioning that.
I was going to say, yes, I've seen that Lillian's in the chat. There's a few old friends here as well in the chat that I've seen as well. So great to see them. I hope I haven't exposed any of my previous clients. I would say, wouldn't I? And so would Lillian. I mean, the EODF is a great source of resources. The ODF is as well in the US. So the kind of professional institutes, if you like, we do have a lot going on in terms of awareness and education and knowledge and sharing and learning for the practitioner community. I would say if you are newish to the if you're newish to the practice of org design, then go get Naomi Stanford's book, right? Naomi Stanford, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So this is the A to Z of org design for practitioners. She's brilliant. Many of you will know exactly who she is. So I was going to say, read a good book, join a club. The EODF is a club. The ODF is a club, a bit more than that. and join in the events that we have. I mean, there's one amazing event going on tomorrow in London, which I'm going to, and probably a few on the call are going to as well, around AI in organization design, hosted by OrgView. That's going on in London 3 till 6 tomorrow. I think it's sold out. But if you're part of the EODF, then you'd find out what those events are, and those, and there's plenty of online events going on as well. Yeah, that's what I would do. And I would say the other thing I would do, though, is find a mentor. Find somebody who is an experienced practitioner, and somebody who's willing to share their knowledge, their experience, provide advice, provide guidance. I wouldn't say a coach. Don't find a coach, because they won't tell you anything. A coach won't tell you anything, but a mentor will. So find a mentor, and that's a really good way of learning.
We also have the EODF book club, where we, it's typically a book, but sometimes we also read articles. We've also read academic articles before in those sessions. And those are nice because they're small sessions, so there's a lot of discussion, and people who are from very diverse backgrounds of experience. The ODF, I believe, still does their coffee and cocktails monthly meetup, which is at a time that's suitable for us in Europe, but also has a lot of folks in America. That's actually how I first got involved in an org design community, was I started going to those, and they are designed to be very welcoming and informal, and they're hosted by Julian Chender, who is also a very talented org designer. And it's all skill levels. There's no judgment there. If you're a total beginner, you can go and you can kind of dig into the questions that they ask. And then that led me ultimately to the EODF, where also there is a rich community of people who are willing to mentor. I think, Richard, you've mentioned to me before that you have mentored people in the past. That's sort of a practice of our community as well. All right. So as we're closing out, we normally try to keep these around 50 minutes, but I do want to ask one last,
We've got 4 minutes.
sort of big question is, what would you say if someone was kind of entering org design, if there's one or two kind of most important things that they need to keep in mind, what would they be?
That they would be that, I think it's one, is that organization design is strategic and it's systemic. So it is about how you align all of the elements of your organization behind what you're trying to achieve, behind a strategy. And if that's clear, then you have a green light. And it's systemic. It's not one dimensional. It is, the organization is a whole system, and the more of that system you can get in the room while you're doing the work, and that's embodied by the people in different functions and different departments, then the more successful your outcome will be. That's what I would say, those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we discuss a lot in the EODF and other communities is that indeed it may feel like more work at the beginning to engage more people, but in the end it is less work in the long run, because you're sort of preparing the organization for change in that way.
Exactly. And the more, Jodie and I work with a kind of principle that says, the more you could, so success is not time to design, it's time to implement. Yeah. So between starting and implementing what you're trying to achieve, that's the measure of success. And the more you can engage people, so it'll feel like a longer time to design, a much shorter time to implement, and the overall time to success will be lower. If I go back in the car industry, the Japanese proved that in the car industry in the 70s and 80s, where they built factories within, factories went up, the years of planning, before any grass was cut, was just immense. And people were wondering, how can they build factories so fast and get into production so fast when they're 2-3 times quicker than anybody else? That's because they were so meticulous in the design, and the engagement of people and the consensus that they built around the plan. and then they implement and execute it, right? And that's the same philosophy goes with org design, I think.
I think that the organization ultimately exists in everyone's head. And so if you put in that effort, then you're building it in their heads, and then they make it happen in reality.
Exactly.
All
Good.
right. Well, thank you so much, Richard. This was
Pleasure.
very interesting. I hope that everyone in the chat also learned from this. I definitely did. And then it sounds like if you want to learn more, if you want to get more kind of advice, then people are free to reach out to you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
no, they are absolutely, of course, yes, 100%. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Very happy.
Well, thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, depending where you are.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.